Start. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon in Australia. So we are very delighted and happy to host here today the first edition of the new Global Bioimaging Spotlight series. And before I start with a short introduction, I want to thank Yara Reis, who's together with the key authors and chairs of the International Working Group for Career Path Development behind the concept for the Spotlight series. And why this is so, why we are bringing it to you, I want to explain in the next few slides. I will show you in a minute. For today, sorry, now I have to enter share. Okay, perfect. Here we go. So today we start with Australia, and we would like to welcome today here Lisa Yen, who's representing Microscopy Australia, Jamie Ridge from the Queensland University of Technology, and Sach Jayasinghe from the Queensland Cyber Infrastructure Foundation. And they will be presenting the mapping and influencing career pathways for core facility staff in Australia. And this is the first part, as I said, of a series that we want to run now at the end of every month for the coming months. And this is based on work that was done in global bioimaging. Global bioimaging is an international network of people working at imaging infrastructures, such as core facility managers and imaging scientists. And as you can see here on this map, they're coming really from all around the globe these days. We started about 10 years ago with this network. At that time, Eurobioimaging, Australia and India Bioimaging joined forces, but very quickly, many other countries joined and many other imaging communities formed. And by now we have 13 official partners that are representing more than 60 countries that are now forming global bioimaging. But in principle, all global bioimaging activities are open to every scientist on this planet. So everyone can join at any time any of our international working groups. And to give you an idea what these are, so at the moment, we have 7 groups up and running, for example, on image data management, biomedical imaging, training or assessment of societal impact of imaging infrastructures, quality systems, and how to talk to your funder. And today we put the emphasis on the one from career development for imaging core facility staff. This working group is up and running for a couple of years, and I'm very happy to see here today Graham Wright from Singerscope, who was the first chair of this working group. And he and his colleagues, which is a huge group from around the world, have been sitting together the past years to understand what are the common challenges, but also the specific challenges for a given location when it comes to the career path development of imaging scientists working in publicly funded infrastructures. And they pull together all this information, general information, but also specific information for given settings, as well as use cases and success stories in an international recommendation, which is called Charting a Course for Success, International Recommendation for Imaging Scientist Careers in Core Facilities. You can find this paper on the Global Bioimaging website, but also since 10 days ago, this is now published in a little bit more concise version in the Journal of Microscopy. However, as this is a huge topic and there are many specific aspects to it, the International Working Group is continuing, and this is also a living document. So we want to continue collecting information from the communities and bring it to this place so that everyone finds something they can use, for example, when they're talking to their dean or director, to make them understand what your career is about and what you are needing to further develop your career. And we thought this information in the recommendation is so important and so rich that we want to translate it into the series. Before I hand over to our speakers from today to actually do that, I want to announce 2 more activities that we are doing in global bioimaging. One is the annual conference that is coming up in Japan this year. It will take place between the 29th to the 31st of October at the Okazaki Conference Center in Japan. We will be hosted by the National Imaging Infrastructure, ABIS. And the topic here is Image Data Horizons, Global Strategies for Accessible Knowledge. You can find more information again on the Global Bioimaging website when you look under Exchange of Experience 2024. I would like to welcome once more Lisa, Jamie, and Sach to present Mapping and Influencing Career Pathways for Core Facility Staff in Australia. Over to you, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Antje. It's great to be here, and it's great to be, I guess, part of the series, and we look forward to lots of other stories that we'll hear from around the globe. It is one of the great things of my role. I'm just going to start to share my screen. Within Microscopy Australia, I'm fortunate to be in the CEO for that group, but I'm also perhaps even more fortunate to currently be the chair of the management board for Global Bioimaging, bringing together such a committed group of leaders in bioimaging around the world. And you've just seen that wonderful map of all of those areas that are represented. So in terms of looking at career pathways for core facility staff in Australia, without it hoping to be too much of a spoiler, we haven't solved it all yet. So not all of the recipe items will be here today, but we hope that our experience might, I guess, inspire conversation and movement as we move towards, I guess, future opportunities and increased recognition. So just a little bit about Microscopy Australia. We do receive government grant funding. We are a distributed network of facilities providing access to advanced microscopy and micro analytical tools all around the country. We place some instruments and experts in 9 facilities that are around Australia, but we have got links into additional laboratories that are located in other institutions and organisations where it is more focused on that career development. And I'll talk a little bit more about that into the future. There is a broad range right from specimen preparation through to visualisation and data analysis across a whole range of techniques. And one of the things that we really do focus on is that it is at equipment and expertise that really comes together within our facilities to support research within Australia. I guess I just wanted to point out that a few years ago, Microscopy Australia redid our strategic plan, and we came up with 4 priorities out of that process and a series of initiatives. And so although obviously fundamentally we're still there to support excellent research, to support innovation and industry, and to enable access to our instruments, I guess I wanted to raise up the fact that one of the things within Microscopy Australia was very focused on trying to work out how to empower facility staff. We came up with some initiatives, but we definitely agree that there's more that can be done in terms of supporting those career pathways, and very much appreciate being part of Global Bioimaging to help push us forward and looking at solutions. So within our facilities, I guess we see that there are a range of different staff, platform or instrument scientists. We also have data specialists. We have technique development specialists. We'd like to have some more industry application scientists. We have piloted some of those roles, and facility leadership that really come together to be that community to support research. And so some of the things that I guess Microscopy Australia has tried to do is look at national committees where we bring people together from various facilities to build that shared best practice. We support a range of masterclasses in advanced training. We also run other workshops or retreats where we bring lots of people together from across Australia from our facilities and linked laboratories. Inspired very much, I think, by our interactions with Global Bioimaging, we do run a staff shadowing program, and we also have had some series of online activities like microchats, which are really sort of for staff to work out sharing experience in terms of technique-focused support within facilities, but also more general topics, as well as webinars that tend to be more of an invited speaker and topical. I wanted to just give a quick little snapshot on the staff shadowing. As I said, this was very much inspired, I think, by our work with global bioimaging, and really the intention here is a 1 to 2 week intensive visit where you actually really get to experience workflows and how another facility operates, to share that best practice. And we offer that both for domestic and international visits within Microscopy Australia. One of the things that I think it also then in turn sort of inspired and provided some additional impact was a new knowledge exchange scheme that we've been running with the Australian Microscopy and Microanalysis Society and the Microscopy New Zealand Society to look at how we can strengthen connections between Australia and New Zealand. I wanted to just also tell you a little bit about the national scheme for Australia, which is our National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Strategy. And this delivers world-class research infrastructure to support high-quality research. One of the strengths, I think, of this particular program is that right from a very early point, it really recognised how it was both the kit or the equipment, but it's also the training, the expertise, and the resources or collections that are needed by industry, that are needed by researchers. And so it's that combination that comes together as a national program to enable those outcomes. So there's over 25 research infrastructures within Australia. There's about 1,800 staff, and that's supporting about 90,000 researchers within Australia each year. And so some of the things that we've done collectively was to focus on areas of national importance. No one can ignore, of course, the pandemic, but also some of those that perhaps might be more specific to Australia, like some bushfires, and trying to recognise First Nations knowledge and knowledge systems. So how does something like the National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Strategy think about staff within facilities? One of the ways that Australia focuses on this is really every 5 years, there's a roadmap that guides that future investment decision and planning. And so although each of those national research infrastructure roadmaps have identified the importance of our skilled workforce, I think that this particular recent roadmap that was from 2021 did really more specifically task our national advisory group to develop a skilled workforce strategy. And so one of the things that I think we're looking forward to within Australia is some outcomes of that work in the coming 12 months, which really ties in nicely with a focus from the global bioimaging community on career pathways. Some of the other things that have happened within Australia was the release of a sort of research infrastructure specialist position paper. And I guess I would sort of think that this echoes and the Global Bioimaging International Recommendations paper and the Journal of Microscopy publication that has just come out recently, which is really focused on trying to increase that awareness of the critical role of research infrastructure specialists within our capabilities. And I guess I'll put a link into the paper to the chat once I finish, but one of the things that I think this position paper really tried to call for was that increased recognition and visibility, but also trying to look for ways to support the development and implementation of a sort of more fit for purpose classificational role for these research infrastructure specialists within the Australian university system, which, like I think was very much a part of the conversations at a global level, kind of tend to draw a separation within universities between academic and administrative job families. And so trying to work out how we recognise and reward that expertise that develops over time within our within the staff within facilities is really something that needs to be tailored to that career pathway and progression and recognition, as well as the responsibilities that additional expertise and specialisation builds over time. So I think what I was trying to do here was really set that very national level, perhaps a couple of examples within Microscopy Australia, But I'm delighted that today I'm joined by Sach, Jayasinghe and Jamie Ritchies, and I think what they're going to now do in this is to sort of try and now take you, maybe increasing in resolution, take you into a little bit more of that experience at an institutional level and then at a personal level. And so I'll hand over now to them.
Thanks, Lisa. I guess I'm up now. Thanks for the invitation to Global Bioimaging, and I guess I'm really happy to have been part of some of the bits of work that the Global Bioimaging have put together, and it's been really rewarding. So as Lisa alluded to, I think what I'm going to talk now is really about the next level of, if you like, resolution and how you might go about changing institutional culture and systems insofar as trying to map out options for core career paths. Next slide. A little while ago, I did put out a paper where I tried to highlight some of these challenges within the Australian context. And also, I guess I have to beg forgiveness here. I mean, reality is that there is some jurisdictional nuances, and Australia has a particular context that you have to work within. So what I am going to talk about today will have some overlap, but it also is very much focused on the Australian experience or the Australian context as well. One of the first challenges in Australia, of course, is that you may or may not know it's a unionised workforce in the university sector. And whilst the NCRIS program that Lisa alluded to is a Commonwealth level, federal level investment, you will find that most of the actual expertise is actually recruited by universities. If you like, they're kind of seconded back to those NCRIS facilities. So the enterprise bargaining agreement and whatever constraints that are there, real or perceived, is very much a challenge for NCRIS as well as within the universities. Australia has inherited this kind of very old system, pretty much based on sort of the British system of this dichotomy in the enterprise bargaining agreement, where you have essentially a two-track system, often academic, professional, or academic or administrative. And the key difference there really is that the academic track recognizes the person, and whereas the administrative or professional is about the job. So it's treated as a job as opposed to, and what that means in the real world is that you're not really looking to advance the person per se, you are thinking about who's the best person for that job. So it's a very different expectations about these two classes, if you like. The problem, of course, there is that many of our research infrastructure expertise are recruited under the professional. So immediately that creates a bit of an issue, because you're saying these people are professional staff. So in some ways, there's a sense of they could be replaced just like an accountant. It's a very professional kind of role, which is not the reality of, as we know, and I don't have to sell that argument to this, to this community. There's also a little bit of a bias in our system, in the culture, where we kind of associate this idea of a technician to somebody who has a limited, and it's sometimes it's about word and language, but somebody who takes instructions and delivers things, but don't necessarily contribute original intellectual input into things. This is just legacy, but in some universities, and I have done some consulting in this space for a number of different universities, some of the smaller universities, that cultural bias is still there, even after everything else that's been discussed here. Also, I guess the executives of universities somehow also fear, cost blowouts. If they were to, for example, think about all of these research infrastructure specialists advancing, but of course it's a very short-term view of cost. Then they sometimes don't appreciate the long-term costs of not rewarding and recognizing your talented staff. So again, it's a bit of a culture and systems change. And we have to also remember in the academic context, it's really the whole system, whether it's peer review through grants, it's really about me, myself, and I, and they're always looking for people who look like them. So there's this kind of halo effect. So the culture is really embedded in rewarding and recognize people who look like you. And so whenever the research infrastructure specialists come into the picture, they're a little bit different. So again, this is classical kind of halo effects and cultural limitations that exist in our system, and they're deeply ingrained and embedded. Obviously, a lot of these things are jurisdictional specific. Next slide, Lisa, please. So, in fact, this slide, I did a survey with a few of my colleagues a little while ago, and I tried to understand the different types of people in the workforce. Unfortunately, there's a little bit of cut off there, but roughly speaking, what I would describe as research infrastructure specialist is probably about, and I think the response rate was about 150 people, is about 35% of the cohort. And there are also people in there who are what I would call traditional academics who get tapped in the shoulder and being told, please look after this bit of equipment. But what happens to these people is that when they go to promotions, often the promotions committees will say, well, what happened? And when you say I was busy running a core facility, it doesn't always cut the mustard when it comes to promotions. So there are some real challenges in recognizing the value of academics who actually contribute as part of the research infrastructure workforce. They might not be badged as such, they might not get the title as such, but again, the workforce is a little bit more complex than just even the research infrastructure specialist or the technician or the technologist. Next slide, Lisa. So thinking about how do you introduce something within an institution, within a university? One of the things that you have to understand is universities are not all the same. They don't all operate the same way. In Australia, and it's common in many other parts of the world, there are different models of actually running a university. And the reason why it's important to understand that model is it kind of dictates how do you make, if you want to influence and make change in that organization, you have to understand the organization and its decision-making processes first. Broadly speaking, there's sort of three different models. There's what's called kind of a centralized model. And what that means is, if you like, the chancellery controls a lot more. And in infrastructure context, it's often the vice president of research or the DVCR of research kind of drives that mandate of research infrastructure. An active management or a matrix model is somewhere in between, where you have some oversight from the center and some, investment into core facilities, but they may ask an institute or a center or a faculty or a school to actually do the day-to-day operations of a facility. And then you have what's called strategic management, which is a highly devolved model. And some universities, especially really big universities, the center has very little to do with research infrastructure. And they will, might have some very broad policy, but most of the decisions are local. So even about career paths, the Faculty of Medicine may have a different view to Faculty of Science. So that becomes another challenge in a university context about how they do, what kind of operating model they adopt across the whole institutions. There's some numbers there, but you can ignore that. I mean, this is some work I did a while back where I kind of made recommendations about what model works best for different research scale. And those dollar numbers are kind of research, what's called higher education research data, something or other. Essentially, it gives you an indication of the scale of research activity within universities. You often find the very small institutions have the devolved model or really big. So either end of the spectrum, you'll have a very devolved model. Next slide, please, Lisa. The next couple of slides, since I believe we're going to share the slides, I'm not going to go through it, but I just want you to have some indication about how the roles and responsibilities for research infrastructure change with these different organizational models. I won't go through it in detail, but hopefully these slides will be shared. Lisa, next slide, and next slide. One more. All right, so now I'll really focus on a case study. So my research infrastructure journey started in the US when I ran a cytometry core facility many, many years ago. And then I ran my own facility at Imperial College. And then when I came to Australia, I essentially took on, if you like, research infrastructure roles in the university sector. I did have a role at Melbourne Uni, a much larger, probably the biggest university in terms of research expenditure. Well, actually, University of Queensland's getting pretty close as well. So that was a different experience, but I'm going to focus on an experience at Queensland University of Technology because this is where I actually had to drive a change from the very beginning, as I started that role at QUT. So I was able to introduce this, if you like, this stream called research infrastructure specialist. But in order to get to that point, the first 12 months, I really need to understand how QUT operated. Again, going back to this idea of how does the university operate? I had to think about who do I need on my side? Who do I really need to convince? And it's not always the Vice-Chancellor, surprisingly. And you've got to follow the money. Who's paying the bills? Who really cares about these changes? And who actually has influence? When I first started at QUT, most of the core facilities were run by 2 institutes. And then the Vice-Chancellor and the DVCR asked me to centralize the research infrastructure. So now at QUT, which Jamie is part of, is a centralized research infrastructure model. So I think it's probably up to about 170 people now within that core facility, centralized research infrastructure. And the main thing, I guess my advice is you have to get the conversation well beyond corporate human resources. Because if you're stuck at human resources, you haven't elevated the conversation high enough to have meaningful impact. And how do you take it beyond HR? Next slide. So I started off with challenging the status quo. So these were small things, small wins that I had to make in order to demonstrate the world doesn't fall over if we do these things. I started off by reading the enterprise bargaining agreement, the most boring thing probably I've ever done. But it was important that I understood it because I needed to challenge corporate HR about the assumptions that they were making or what they were saying to me about what can or cannot be done because of the supposed enterprise bargaining agreement. And also, courtesy of some of the work I did through my MBA, I was able to talk their language and talk about human resource best practice. And good examples of these things is that I challenged the fact that, well, don't we need to think about equal opportunity and equity across our staff? So why would we, if you go back to the academic versus administrative, why would we treat one cohort as individuals and another as jobs? And I'm still grappling with this, how that could be an equitable or equal, provide equal opportunity for people. It's still not fixed in the system, but by just simply challenging that, I made my colleagues in HR think about that a little bit more. And I did also say to them, you know what? I need great engineers. I don't care if they have a PhD or not. So why don't I just use the academic track for what it is? It's a tool. They don't have to be academics. You can still use the HR tool to appoint people. And this is the first time they even thought about it this way. Because what was happening is that we've got to stop HR thinking that the enterprise bargaining agreement is the be-all, end-all. After all, it's a tool to help you get the best people. If the tool is not helping you do that, then you need to move beyond the tool. So some of the things I did was I convinced HR to advertised roles that were either academic or professional at the same time. You know, butting heads, but eventually getting those things through. And I, you know, put academic roles without PhDs. I advertised for engineer, senior engineer that were at a level E, the same level as a professor, and so on and so forth. So kept pushing for these small wins and getting them through the system and demonstrating to them I'm able to get the right people. Going back to best HR practice, ultimately HR's role is to help you get the best and brightest people, not to limit you in doing that core objective. Through all these activities, I was also able to then move one or two staff from the professional track to the academic track by saying this is the research infrastructure specialist stream. And through that model, we were then able to demonstrate, and maybe Jamie will give you what that means in the real world, because Jamie was also moved that stream. And also, at the time I was there, I was able to recruit people from overseas, including from Singapore, with Tony, for example, who came from Singapore to Australia. And Tony's first response was, I wouldn't have come unless you offered me that stream. So there is, and those stories, playing them back to the executives of the university was really important to reiterate this is actually beneficial. And in the long run, the value, if you like, the benefit, cost-benefit analysis is much more positive than what you originally think, or maybe what they thought it was going to be. Next slide. So then it's really a question about how do you embed this change? So I was able to convince the provost at the time to have this research infrastructure stream. And what that in turn led to was the QUT's academic career framework actually has points in it under learning and teaching, research and research training, leadership and engagement that speaks to the role of a research infrastructure specialist. And the fact that it's in the academic career framework now embeds a process where you can, as part of your promotions, your application for promotions, you can speak to the fact that you might not be supervising a PhD or a master's student, but you just taught 200 people on mass spec or imaging or microscopy. Under research and research training, you can talk about your methods development and so on and so forth. So I think it opened the door for new KPIs and new metrics to measure somebody's value and contribution to the research and research training enterprise that's much more broader than the traditional academic. It also helped, if you go back to my point about these academics who come in and out of supporting research infrastructure. So typically in Australia, what they call a teaching and research academic has this workload model of 40-40-20. 40% of the time teaching, 40% of the time research, and 20% leadership. All of a sudden, now you can kind of think about a research infrastructure specialist that might do maybe 10% teaching and doing, training people, maybe 20% doing research in terms of their own interest in method development, and 70% of the time they're leading a core facility, for example. So all of a sudden, you had much more nuanced workload models that could be recognized to the promotions committee. Now, these percentages are just things that I made up, and perhaps Jamie can allude to some of the more details around that. But that was the key thing: the long-term embedding, so that it can't be undone, and it's now firmly embedded in the culture of the university. Of course, the other important part, as part of the change, was that as part of the change at QUT, my recommendations to set up a Vice-Chancellor research infrastructure, senior researcher, senior academic was also established, and my colleague Stephen Blanksby took on that role. But Stephen also participates in the promotions committee. So he speaks and advocates on behalf of the research infrastructure specialists. So another important component of embedding that change for the long term and making sure that cultural changes are embedded in the university's policy and systems and processes. I think that might be the last slide, if I remember. Back to institutional. Yeah, so at the University of Melbourne, they do also have what's called an academic specialist, and I took this blurb out of their one of their documents. It's very similar to the research infrastructure specialist, but it's really focused more on the traditional academic and the change there. But the thing to note here is because the University of Melbourne is a highly devolved university, going back to the operating model, this is the view of the Faculty of Medicine. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the view of some of the other faculties. So again, going back to Lisa's point, we have made some inroads, but without sort of these global perspectives of global best practice, like the work that the global bioimaging is doing, some of these things can still be very sporadic and doesn't get embedded more holistically in the systems and processes, even at an institutional level, even within an institution. Similarly, at the Australian National University, my colleague Uta, pretty much said we have to make some of our leading research infrastructure specialist professors of practice. So another way of recognizing and providing some recognition to the staff, but again, it's sporadic, it's not embedded. So I guess the take-home message for me is that it's still a long way to go, as Lisa alluded to, but if you want to make meaningful change in an institution, you need to fully understand what's your environment you're working with, who do you need to convince, and you must embed it somehow in the systems. Otherwise, it could easily be torn down. I think that is the last slide. Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Over to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Sach. So thanks. I'd like to also thank Antje and Johanna for the opportunity to talk today. And I was just going to give basically my view, a little bit about my pathway through being an imaging scientist or a research infrastructure specialist, whatever you want to call it, and my experience at QUT during this process. So could you go to the next slide, please, Lisa? So every sort of good hero or villain needs an origin story, and that's mine. I was introduced to electron microscopy during postgraduate research, looking at high-temperature superconductors, and really enjoyed it. John Barry was my supervisor and had a great enthusiasm for the technique. And as most people do, when you finish the PhD, I went off overseas to do a postdoc, also working in high-temperature superconductors. But the model, the operating model there was a bit different when it came to research infrastructure. I couldn't actually get my hands on the microscopes, and I had to sit next to an engineer who would go and move where I wanted him to and take the pictures. And I found this very dissatisfying. And at that point, I sort of realized that I didn't have the passion that was required for a career in this particular research field, but I did really enjoy using the electron microscopes, and I wanted to focus more on doing that in the future. So next slide, please, Lisa. So when I came back to Australia, I looked for a job and was fortunate that one opened up at the local core facility and another sort of research institute, which had a joint position. And there's a series of roles that I've had, and in the interest of time and also just not boring you to death, I'm not going to go through them all. But what I wanted to highlight here was that the jobs that I've had have had a range of different titles, and they've also spanned academic positions and professional staff positions as well. But the jobs themselves, there's no slides?
No, we can see the slides.
Okay. I just saw something in the chat. Okay, yeah, so the jobs themselves are very similar in terms of the actual activities that I was doing. I was working as a lot of core facility scientists would. Training users was a large part of the job, as was maintaining instruments and doing research, either collaboratively with other researchers or occasionally sort of independently. And when it comes towards the more recent positions that I've had, there have been additional responsibilities in terms of things like managing staff and more responsibility for writing grants and getting funding and things. But yeah, I just wanted to point out that this career pathway is sort of a reflection of the core facility staff member and how it straddles over those two traditional roles that we have here in Australia and in probably a lot of other areas. So Lisa, could you go to the next slide? Now, during the time that I was, or still am, but while I was going through that whole process, I ran into a series of challenges and frustrations. And again, these are probably fairly common. One of the things that I found was that one of the things that made it great was the diversity of research problems that you got exposed to and the ability to sort of learn how to apply your skills or learn new skills to new ones. But it did mean that publication records look quite spotty, and I think this is a real disadvantage when it comes to applying for grant funding. It doesn't show the sort of depth of expertise or interest that I think those granting bodies are looking for when they hand out the money. So it puts you at a disadvantage there. Another one was just the opportunity for recognition. And in the university system, the currency for recognition is largely sort of publications and co-authorships. And those ones, I think the situation's getting a lot better now, but certainly earlier on, there was a lot of perceptions about core facility staff just being someone who presses a button and, you know, figure 2A pops out of the microscope. So there are occasions there where I think authorship wasn't granted where it should have been, or even when positions within the author list didn't really reflect the intellectual contribution that had gone onto projects. And the last one there was in terms of the opportunity for advancement. Sach has already spoken about the two streams that we have here and how that one of them is based on a position and the other one on a person. But essentially for the professional staff ones, it's extremely difficult for someone to get ahead. You really need to have the position reclassified and demonstrate to the university that the job you're doing is substantially different from the one that you were hired for and that it's more valuable to the university. And they tend to look at these things and value them depending upon how many people report to you. So if you're someone in charge of a large unit, you deserve a higher level. And if you're only having microscopes reporting to you, then that's a harder sell. The other one there is the academic staff pathway, and that does have a well-established pathway for promotion, but it is tailored towards those traditional academic roles. And I think these first two parts here, the problems in terms of getting publications and granting success means that it's really more challenging for someone like a research infrastructure specialist to get ahead in that system. So that's why I was very happy about the introduction of this research infrastructure specialist pathway at QUT. I did transition over. So initially I was hired as an academic with a home in the school and the faculty, and another sort of home at the institute, which is where the core facility was based at that point. But now moving into the research infrastructure specialist, I was happy to do that because it seemed to better reflect my interests and also what my day-to-day activities and responsibilities were. So can you go to the next slide, please, Lisa? Yeah, and so Sach has already spoken about the academic career framework, but there was a short time and there was a fair bit of text there. So I thought I might just highlight one of the aspects there which speaks directly to core facility staff. And this was one of the indicators. So they have benchmarks sort of saying what level you should be performing at in those different aspects, so teaching and learning, research and so on. And then they have indicators saying how that could look, so what excellence in research may look like. And one of the ones there is just highlighted in the red, and this is something which recognises the contribution of the core facility staff, not necessarily into the direct publication records and things, but in terms of facilitating the research of other researchers at the institution. So I was encouraged to apply for promotion, and I put in an application and basically centred a large part of it around this, just sort of demonstrating how during my time in charge of the microscopy facility or laboratory, the research output had increased. So trying to find the things that the university cares about, which typically is publications, grant income, and completions, and just showing those, the growth of those, and that the trend was in the right direction. And also just in terms of sort of trying to demonstrate the value to the university using a particular example. So we had we managed to get an aberration-corrected TEM into the facility, and I was sort of involved in that in a range of different stages. So going from being a chief investigator on the initial grant, not the lead CI, we had a laureate professor, a laureate fellow professor there with excellent track records and a traditional academic, but still being involved there as one of the 5 CIs, and also in terms of the renovation project to deliver a space which would be suitable for housing this sort of instrument. I was sort of intimately involved in that, and then later with the delivery, the installation, the commissioning of the instrument. And this was sort of a challenge because it was during COVID, and so it was not straightforward to get engineers out here. So I was fortunate that was successful. The one thing that I was going to mention about was the other parts here also have been, these have been challenges that have been faced by other research infrastructure specialists, and I sort of regret not putting their faces up and giving more details on them, but they have also had similar issues. But one of the ones that we've had was just in terms of the promotion process. Sach just sort of mentioned that the DVC for research, Pro Vice-Chancellor for Research Infrastructure is involved in that. And I'm not sure if that was initially the case, because before, earlier on, it was, it had to go through the faculties and schools, and that was a bit of a challenge because the research infrastructure specialists didn't actually have a home in the faculties, and so their connection with the researchers was a direct one-to-one rather than through the head of school. So it was, it needed a little bit of education to let the head of school know the value that they were bringing to their particular organisation. Yes, but it is really good that they have someone there now who's familiar with research infrastructure and core facility and how they all work together. And I'd just like to say that I got a lot of support from management within CARF and research infrastructure at the whole stage throughout this. And I've been very fortunate to have people that I've worked for who are all very supportive in this way. We can go to the next slide, please, Lisa. So just in terms of the conclusions, the things that I've found during the journey and more recently here at QUT is, at least my perception of this, is that the introduction of this third pathway is a very slow process. It's not something which can be rushed and which will happen overnight. And it does require buy-in from people at senior levels within the organisation. I think in QUT, we've been fortunate that at least the people that I perceive as being the key decision makers had a lot of experience either in core facilities or working with them, or at least having a characterisation background. So they understood the value that these sort of facilities can bring to a university. But I don't think that's universal. So I think if you're at a university or an organisation where maybe that isn't as well appreciated, it would be good to take any opportunity to sort of go and educate or lobby for the value of your facility to these people. And it will need multiple attempts. And I think talking to anyone who's further up the chain and getting them to lobby on your behalf would be a valuable thing. And I don't know, this next point here about metrics, I don't know if this is specific to Australian universities or not, but they seem completely obsessed with metrics, and anything that you can put a number to is going to be much better than, say, a recommendation from a researcher about how valuable you are. So I think being able to collect all of the data, the relevant data that speaks to the factors that the university higher-ups are interested in is really important, and being able to show how the core facilities have improved those aspects for the university is a very powerful and persuasive sort of message. So finally, I hope that the things that have been put in place within Australia, so at QUT and ANU and Melbourne, can act as sort of an example and perhaps some way that people could approach things, and maybe take away some of the risk from universities who see those things about just an increase in cost and not really seeing the benefit that it comes from things like just in terms of retaining the staff that you already have, saves the expenditure of getting all this new staff in. And it also is very valuable in terms of attracting quality staff to the university, because Sach has spoken about Tony not willing to be willing to come out here, but even in terms of bringing in distinguished professors or capacity building professors, the presence of high quality and well-functioning core facilities is really important to a lot of those ones. So I think universities becoming more aware of this would be a good thing, and would help us push forward these sorts of changes. So thanks. Sorry for taking so much time, but happy to take any questions.